Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere considerably more dangerous than a haunted house, considerably more treacherous than a dark alley at midnight, and considerably more terrifying than your dentist's waiting room. Tonight we are stepping into the courts, the bedchambers, the scheming corridors, and the blood-stained thrones of history's most evil queens. And yes, evil is the word. Not misunderstood, not just assertive, not merely difficult, evil. These were women who poisoned rivals for sport, ordered executions before breakfast, bathed in the blood of young girls, and rewrote the laws of entire kingdoms just so they could commit crimes that weren't technically illegal yet. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what we do here. And a very special, genuine thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. You know who you are, and honestly you have impeccable taste in nightmare fuel. Your suggestions are the engine that keeps this channel going, and every time someone drops an idea in the comments, it genuinely shapes what we make next. We're also now on Spotify, so if you want to drift off to this during a commute or a long sleepless night, the link is down in the description. Now, dim those lights. Turn on a fan for that soft white noise. Pull your blanket all the way up, and maybe check under the bed, because tonight's subjects are the kind of women who would absolutely use that as a hiding spot. Let's just take a second before we dive in. Have you ever wondered what it actually took to rule as a queen in a world that didn't want you in charge? Did they wake up evil, or did centuries of being underestimated slowly do the work for them? Could you survive at court knowing your closest advisor might be the very person stirring poison into your goblet? Did some of these women genuinely believe they were doing the right thing, or did they just not care? And was there a point, a single afternoon, a single bad Tuesday, where they crossed a line they could never come back from? Congratulations, you have just woken up somewhere between the 6th and the 19th century, in a palace that is beautiful on the outside and absolutely feral on the inside. The chandeliers are magnificent, the gowns are extraordinary, and the woman on the throne is smiling at you, which, it turns out, is the most frightening thing in the room. Before we meet the women themselves, let's talk about the stage they were shoved onto, usually without being asked. Being a queen in history was not the gilded fantasy the word implies. You were, depending on the century, either a diplomatic bargaining chip handed off at age 12, a womb with a crown on it, or a figurehead kept just powerful enough to be useful, and just powerless enough to be controlled. You owned your wardrobe and very little else. Your husband's debts were yours. Your children could be taken. Your throne could vanish if you failed to produce a son, or if the wrong person whispered the wrong thing in the wrong ear on the wrong evening. The women who feature in this story were born into systems specifically designed to break them. Some broke the system instead. Others broke everything in sight, and a few broke so completely that the wreckage lasted generations. Let's be specific about what the job actually involved. You were first and foremost an alliance. Your marriage had nothing to do with your feelings and everything to do with land, trade routes, and the prevention of war, or occasionally the starting of one. You were selected for your bloodline, your health, your family's political connections, and sometimes, if everyone was feeling generous, your face. You were sent to a foreign court, often before you were fully grown, to live among strangers who spoke a different language and prayed to the same god in a slightly different way, which could get you executed if you weren't careful about which version you were seen performing. Once there, you had to produce an heir. Not an heir eventually, not an heir when you were ready, but an heir soon, and ideally male. Because a daughter was considered a consolation prize with diplomatic potential, and a son was considered the actual point. Your body was not your own. Physicians examined you, courtiers tracked your cycles. If you failed to conceive, rumours started. If you miscarried, the rumours got louder. If you kept miscarrying, the throne started looking at you the way a landlord looks at a tenant who keeps missing rent. And the court itself, let's talk about the court. Imagine your workplace, but everyone is trying to get you fired. Some of them are trying to get you killed. Nobody will tell you which is which. And the person with the most power over your continued employment is also the person most likely to be sleeping with someone else. That is the Tudor court on a quiet Tuesday. That is Versailles before lunch. That is the Byzantine palace on a good day. Information was currency. Alliances shifted like sand. And the woman at the centre of all of it had to smile through every banquet, every mass, every public appearance, while simultaneously running a household, managing her ladies-in-waiting, navigating her husband's moods, and trying to figure out which of her servants were reporting back to her enemies. The queens who survived, really survived, not just outlasted their husbands, but actually held power, were the ones who understood the game fast and played it better than anyone expected. Some used charm, some used money, some used children as political weapons and marriage alliances as chess moves, and some, when charm and money and children weren't enough, used methods that history has spent 5 centuries nervously tiptoeing around. That is the world they came from. That is the world that made them. And whether you call what they did survival or evil, or both at once, you cannot understand any of it without first understanding what they were up against before they even opened their eyes on the first morning of their reign. She entered the imperial palace of the Tang dynasty as a concubine at the age of 13, a girl with no rank, no army, no allies, and no particular reason to believe she would ever be anything more than a footnote in someone else's story. And yet, Wu Zetian would go on to become the only woman in over 3,000 years of Chinese imperial history to rule in her own name, with the title of emperor, not empress, not regent, not consort, emperor. To get there, she survived the deaths of emperors, outlasted rivals who had every advantage she lacked, and built a power base from scratch in a court that would have executed her for far less than ambition. The girl nobody saw coming became the woman nobody could stop. She was born in 624 AD to a father who was a timber merchant turned military governor, comfortable, successful, not remotely imperial. Her mother came from the aristocratic Yang clan, which gave Wu a connection to respectable society, and absolutely no guarantee of anything beyond a decent marriage to a decent man in a decent house somewhere that history would never bother to record. What Wu had instead was something more dangerous. She could read. She read history, poetry, music, and politics at a time when female literacy was considered unnecessary at best and suspicious at worst. She was, by accounts written by people who genuinely did not want to compliment her, extremely intelligent and extremely aware of it. When she entered Emperor Taizong's court, she was given the title Talented One, a mid-ranking concubine position that meant she was educated and presentable enough to be in the emperor's company without embarrassing anyone. She did not, from available records, become one of Taizong's favourites. She spent 14 years in that palace watching how power actually worked. Who had it? Who pretended to have it? Who lost it? And why? And what the difference was between the women who survived a change of emperor and the ones who didn't. It was an education that no school in Tang Dynasty China was offering, and she absorbed every lesson. What made Wu different from the other concubines around her wasn't just ambition, though she had that in quantities that made the people who noticed it visibly uncomfortable. It was patience. She could wait. She could smile. She could appear for as long as necessary to be exactly what a woman in her position was supposed to be: quiet, decorative, and gratefully dependent. And then, when the moment was right, she moved with a speed and precision that left her rivals looking around wondering what had just happened. She was not universally loved. She was not trying to be. Love, in the Tang imperial court, was a resource that ran out. Respect was useful but could be manufactured. Fear lasted longer than either. By the time Wu Zetian was done, the most powerful empire in the world had a woman at its head. A woman who had arrived at 13 with nothing but a mind like a sharpened blade, and the discipline to keep it sheathed until exactly the right moment. That moment took decades to arrive. She used every one of them. When the Emperor Taizong died, the rules were clear. His concubines, all of them, including the young Wu, were to be sent to Buddhist nunneries, their heads shaved, their lives effectively over. Wu Zetian did not go quietly into that nunnery. Through a combination of timing, intelligence, and what historians politely describe as a previous relationship with the new Emperor Gaozong, she managed the near impossible. She came back. She returned to court not as a disgraced concubine, but as an increasingly powerful presence, steadily displacing the existing empress, acquiring allies, and making herself indispensable to a man who, by most accounts, was genuinely in love with her, and genuinely not paying attention to how much ground she was gaining. Gaozong was not, by historical consensus, a strong emperor. He was decent, well-intentioned, frequently ill, and susceptible to the influence of people he trusted. Wu Zetian became the person he trusted most. She read state documents with him. She offered opinions on policy. She attended audiences from behind a curtain, technically appropriate for a woman of her position, practically a front-row seat to every decision being made in the empire. She learned the machinery of imperial governance from the inside, lever by lever, while appearing to do nothing more than support her emperor. Meanwhile, the existing Empress Wang was losing ground without quite understanding why. Wu was charming to the Empress's allies. Wu was visible at exactly the moments that mattered. Wu was, in the language of the court, simply present, reliably, warmly, strategically present, while the Empress grew frustrated, then anxious, then desperate. The Empress made the mistake that people in her position always make. She underestimated the woman she was watching. She assumed that charm was not strategy. She assumed that a concubine, however clever, knew her place. She assumed wrong. The campaign Wu ran against Empress Wang was not a frontal assault. It was a slow, patient erosion. Rumours here, a quiet alliance there, a well-timed display of loyalty to Gaozong that made the Empress look unreliable by comparison. Wu cultivated the Emperor's affection with the same methodical attention she applied to everything else. She bore him sons which mattered enormously. She positioned those sons as the obvious heirs which mattered even more. She made herself, in short, necessary to Gaozong personally, necessary to the succession, necessary to the stability of the court. By 655, Empress Wang had been demoted, stripped of her title, and imprisoned. The charges against her were sorcery and plotting against the emperor, the standard accusations deployed against inconvenient women of rank when no other pretext was available. Whether Wu manufactured the evidence or simply allowed suspicion to harden into accusation is not something the historical record specifies. What the record does show is the outcome. Wu Zetian was elevated to Empress, the most powerful female position in the Tang Empire before the year was out. The women who had watched her do this were mostly silent about it. The men who watched were loudly horrified, and wrote about their horror at considerable length, which is how we know as much as we do. But being horrified did not stop her. Being written about unfavourably did not slow her down. Wu Zetian had spent decades learning how a court worked, and she had learned the most important lesson of all. The people who write the history are rarely the people who make it. History has never been able to fully prove that Wu Zetian killed her own infant daughter, but history has also never been able to fully prove she didn't. The story, as it was recorded by court historians who were not exactly fans of hers, goes like this. The Empress Wang visited the baby's chambers, and shortly afterward the infant was found dead. Wu Zetian immediately accused the Empress of murder. Emperor Gaozong, devastated, demoted and then executed the Empress Wang and her ally consort Xiao. Wu, weeping and blameless, was elevated in their place. Whether she staged the death of her own child to eliminate rivals is a question that has haunted her legacy ever since, and the answer you choose to believe says quite a lot about how you read ambition. The historians who recorded this story were, to be precise about it, men who had strong ideological reasons to portray Wu Zetian as unnatural. A woman who ruled as emperor violated the Confucian order so fundamentally that making her monstrous was almost a structural requirement of the narrative. Infanticide was the worst thing a mother could do. Attaching it to her made her irredeemable. It may also have been completely true. The honest answer is that nobody who was in that room left a reliable account of what actually happened, and by the time anyone was writing about it, Wu's enemies had every reason to embellish, and her defenders had every reason to deny. What is documented, and rather thoroughly, is that people who posed direct threats to Wu Zetian had a troubling tendency to die or disappear. 2 of her sons were deposed, 1 exiled, 1 kept under such suffocating supervision that the distinction between confinement and freedom became largely philosophical. Several high-ranking officials who challenged her authority were executed on charges of conspiracy, some of them almost certainly genuine, some of them almost certainly not. She created and deployed a network of informers and secret police, the feared agents of her Wanshui Tongtian era, who made it professionally inadvisable to criticise her in public and personally dangerous to do so in private. She also encouraged denunciations, establishing suggestion boxes throughout the empire where citizens could report disloyalty. This sounds almost civic-minded until you consider that the people doing the denouncing were frequently settling personal scores, and the people being denounced had very limited recourse once the machinery of accusation started moving. It was, in practice, a system that kept the population slightly afraid and the empress continuously informed, which was exactly the point. And yet, and this is the part that gets lost in the drama of the deaths, Wu Zetian's reign produced real and lasting reforms. She expanded the civil examination system so that talented men from non-aristocratic families could rise in government, which broke the stranglehold of the old nobility on imperial power. She promoted capable officials regardless of their birth. She was, by multiple accounts, an attentive and effective administrator who read reports carefully and made decisions quickly. The empire did not fall apart under her. In some measurable ways it thrived. She was ruthless and she was effective, and in the Tang dynasty court those things were not a contradiction. They were a job description. For years Wu Zetian ruled from behind the curtain, first as empress consort, then as regent, technically acting on behalf of her sons. But her sons were figureheads, in every meaningful sense of the word. One she deposed. One she kept close enough to control and far enough away to be harmless. By the time she was in her 60s, an age at which most people in that era were either dead or considered lucky to be standing, Wu Zetian dropped the pretense entirely. In 690 she proclaimed a new dynasty, the Zhou, with herself as its sole ruler and emperor. She held that title for 15 years. She reformed the civil examination system, promoted talent over aristocratic birth, built a functioning secret police apparatus, and executed anyone who suggested this was irregular. It was, by any measure, irregular. It was also extraordinary. The proclamation itself was not made in a panic or a crisis. It was made from a position of strength, which is perhaps the most remarkable thing about it. Wu had been the functional ruler of China for years before she made it official. Changing the title was almost administrative at that point, a formalization of what everyone already knew and nobody was willing to say out loud. When she announced the new Zhou dynasty, the court accepted it. The military accepted it. The population, which had seen her govern capably for decades, mostly accepted it. The historians did not accept it, but the historians were writing after the fact and the empire was still standing, so their objections had a somewhat hollow ring. She was in her mid-60s when she took the title of emperor. She ruled until she was 81. During those years she conducted military campaigns that expanded Chinese territory, managed diplomatic relations with neighbouring kingdoms with a deftness that kept several potential conflicts from becoming actual ones, and continued the administrative reforms that had defined her earlier rule. She was not a figurehead emperor. She was not a symbolic emperor. She read the documents, she made the decisions, she showed up. The court around her was not always comfortable with this. There were conspiracies, real ones, not manufactured ones, by men who believed the natural order required a male emperor and were willing to act on that belief. Wu survived them all. Some of the conspirators were executed, some were exiled, some simply failed in ways that left them alive but politically finished, which was occasionally more useful than killing them outright, since a man publicly humiliated is a warning to others in a way that a man quietly buried is not. In 705, when Wu was 80 years old and seriously ill, a group of senior officials and military commanders carried out a coup, forcing her to abdicate in favour of her son Zhongzong, restoring the Tang dynasty. She died the same year in the palace she'd inhabited for most of her life, with the title Empress Dowager, a demotion from emperor technically, though by that point she was dying, and the distinction had a somewhat ceremonial quality to it. She left instructions for her tomb. No inscription, just a blank stele. Let posterity write whatever it wanted. She had nothing to prove and apparently nothing to apologise for. The blank stone is still there. Posterity, as promised, has had a great deal to say. History remembers her as Bloody Mary, the queen who burned nearly 300 Protestants at the stake in less than 4 years and earned a nickname so sticky that centuries later, people are still mixing vodka and tomato juice in her honour. But before she became that, Mary Tudor spent a very long time being a daughter whose father couldn't quite decide whether she existed. Henry VIII had her declared legitimate, then illegitimate, then legitimate again, depending on what marriage he was currently on and how he felt about the last one. She watched her mother, Catherine of Aragon, die in disgrace. She was separated from her, forbidden to visit, kept at a distance until the separation itself became a form of punishment. By the time Mary finally took the throne at age 37, she had been waiting her entire life. What she did with that throne is, depending on your perspective, a tragedy, a reign of terror, or both at once. Mary was born in 1516, the only surviving child of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, and for her first 9 years she was treated as the jewel of the Tudor court, educated by the best tutors England could provide, presented at court functions with obvious pride, referred to by the Spanish ambassador as arguably the most beautiful child he had ever seen. She was being raised for queenship, she was being prepared for power, and then Anne Boleyn arrived, and the world shifted, and Mary's place in it shifted with it. The years that followed were, by any reasonable measure, a sustained psychological assault. Her parents' marriage was declared invalid, which made her illegitimate. Her title of princess was stripped. She was now just the Lady Mary. She was sent to serve in the household of her infant half-sister Elizabeth, a deliberate humiliation designed to make clear who mattered now and who didn't. She was separated from her mother with a completeness that left Catherine of Aragon writing desperate letters, begging to see her daughter at least once before she died. The request was denied. Catherine died in 1536 without seeing Mary again. Mary submitted eventually to the demands of her father's regime. She signed documents acknowledging the annulment of her parents' marriage and her own illegitimacy, documents she would later describe as signed under duress, with considerable guilt. The signing kept her alive and marginally functional at court. It did not heal anything. Underneath the compliance was a woman who had watched her mother destroyed by a man who was supposed to protect her, who had been publicly humiliated for years, who had held on to her Catholic faith as the one thing nobody could legislate away, and who had been waiting, with remarkable discipline, for the moment when she could finally stop pretending this was acceptable. That moment came in 1553, when Edward VI died without an heir, and the attempt to replace Mary with Lady Jane Grey collapsed within 9 days. The country rallied to Mary. She rode into London to enormous crowds and genuine popular enthusiasm. People did not want Jane Grey. They wanted the legitimate Tudor, the daughter of the popular Catherine of Aragon, the woman who had waited and endured. She was their queen. What she did next was entirely her own, shaped by everything those 37 years had built inside her. The cruelty she showed was real. So was the grief that preceded it. Mary's stated goal when she took the English throne in 1553 was not revenge, though revenge would have been understandable given the circumstances. Her stated goal was the restoration of Catholicism to a country that had spent 20 years being dismantled from the faith she had been raised in. She genuinely believed she was saving souls. She also genuinely believed that burning the bodies of heretics was the appropriate method for doing so. The first executions of prominent Protestant figures like Thomas Cranmer, Hugh Latimer, and Nicholas Ridley had a grim, targeted logic to them. These were men who had shaped the Reformation that had destroyed her mother's marriage and her own childhood. What followed was less targeted. Nearly 300 people burned across England in less than 4 years. Most of them were weavers, farmers, and tradespeople, ordinary people who had simply adopted a faith that was now, again, illegal. The Marian persecutions, as historians call them, began in earnest in 1555. The heresy laws that had been repealed under Edward VI were restored, and the machinery of religious prosecution resumed operations with a thoroughness that her advisers, including her husband, Philip II of Spain, periodically suggested might be counterproductive. Philip was not opposed to burning Protestants on principle. He was opposed to burning them at a rate that was generating martyrs faster than they could be forgotten. Mary was not interested in the public relations calculus. She was interested in the souls. The executions took place in public, which was standard for the period and intended as deterrents. What happened instead was that they became theatre, and the Protestants dying in them performed with a conviction that undermined the intended message entirely. Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, who had publicly recanted his Protestant faith before his execution, and then recanted the recantation at the stake, thrusting the hand that had signed the false confession into the flames first, became immediately and irrevocably a martyr. Latimer's words to Ridley as they were chained to the stake, "Be of good comfort and play the man, for we shall this day light such a candle in England as shall never be put out," were being repeated across the country within days. You cannot burn people into silence when the burning itself becomes their loudest argument. Mary understood this less well than she might have. Her faith was not cynical, it was absolute, which is a quality that is admirable in saints and catastrophic in monarchs executing religious policy. She was devout in the way that only someone who has held onto their faith through active persecution can be, with a ferocity that had no room left in it for doubt or adjustment. 300 people burned in less than 4 years. The estimate, compiled by the martyrologist John Fox in his Book of Martyrs, published under Mary's successor, shaped English Protestant identity for generations. Mary's nickname, Bloody Mary, came directly from Fox's account. She died in 1558 at age 42, from what was likely influenza compounded by uterine or ovarian cancer. She had twice believed herself pregnant. Both times the pregnancies proved false. Philip had long since returned to Spain, treating the English marriage as the diplomatic inconvenience it had always been to him. England had lost Calais, its last territory in France, on her watch, a loss she reportedly said would be found engraved on her heart. She died with the country she had tried to restore to Rome, already tilting back toward Protestantism under the shadow of her half-sister Elizabeth, who was 25 years old and entirely ready. The candle Latimer had promised, as it turned out, had not gone out. She appears on statues. She appears in history books as a visionary who funded Columbus's voyage and unified Spain. She was also the monarch who, alongside her husband Ferdinand, established the Spanish Inquisition, expelled every Jewish person from Spain in 1492, somewhere between 100 and 200,000 people on roughly 4 months' notice, and authorized the forced conversion or expulsion of Spain's Muslim population shortly afterward. Queen Isabella of Castile was deeply, sincerely religious, and she used that faith as both a compass and a weapon. Her story is a case study in how easily conviction becomes cruelty when the person holding it also holds the army. Isabella came to power in a Castile that was, to put it diplomatically, a mess. The preceding decades had featured civil war, a weak king, a disputed succession, and a nobility so fractious and self-interested that governing the country was roughly equivalent to herding cats in a hurricane. Isabella, who had grown up watching her half-brother's reign deteriorate into something close to farce, had strong opinions about order and stronger opinions about who should be providing it. She was 18 when she made an unauthorised marriage to Ferdinand of Aragon. Unauthorised because her brother had other plans for her, and she had other plans for herself. It was one of the more consequential elopements in European history. Together, Isabella and Ferdinand created the foundations of a unified Spanish state, standardizing laws, curtailing the power of the nobility, building institutions that would outlast their reign. They were, by the political standards of their era, genuinely effective rulers. Isabella personally supervised military campaigns, rode with her armies, and was present at the Siege of Granada, the last Muslim kingdom in Spain, which fell in 1492, the same year Columbus sailed. That year, by most reckonings, was the pivot point of her reign, the year she did everything she's celebrated for and everything she's not. The expulsion of Spain's Jewish population, the Alhambra Decree signed in March of 1492, gave practicing Jews 4 months to either convert to Christianity or leave the country. Everything they could not carry or sell quickly had to be abandoned. Sales of property in that window were conducted at a fraction of real value, because the buyers knew the sellers had no choice. Communities that had lived in Spain for centuries, that had produced scholars, physicians, mathematicians, and merchants whose contributions to Spanish society were woven into its fabric, were dismantled in 4 months. The human cost was enormous. The economic cost to Spain was enormous. Isabella signed the decree because she believed Jewish presence corrupted the faith of Christian converts and threatened the religious unity she had decided was the foundation of her state. The Spanish Inquisition, which had been operating since 1478, provided the enforcement mechanism. Tomás de Torquemada, her confessor and Grand Inquisitor, oversaw proceedings that became a byword across Europe for cruelty justified by piety. Isabella believed in all of it. She believed the Inquisition was saving souls. She believed the expulsion was protecting her kingdom. She died in 1504 with a reputation for sanctity. She was eventually beatified by the Catholic Church, though her canonization process has stalled repeatedly, partly for reasons you can probably identify without much assistance. When people make jokes about the Spanish Inquisition, they're joking about something that was, in practice, a systematic state apparatus for detecting, interrogating, and punishing religious nonconformity, with torture as a standard tool and burning at the stake as its most visible outcome. Torquemada, Isabella's Grand Inquisitor, oversaw an estimated 2,000 executions. The actual number of people tortured, imprisoned, or forced into false confessions runs into the tens of thousands. Isabella did not design the Inquisition in a fit of madness. She designed it carefully, requested papal authorization, and maintained oversight. It was a policy, not a panic, and that somehow makes it worse. The original stated purpose of the Spanish Inquisition was relatively specific: to identify and prosecute conversos, Jewish and Muslim converts to Christianity, who were suspected of secretly continuing their original religious practices. The concern, from the Crown's perspective, was that recent converts were insincere, performing Christianity publicly while maintaining older traditions privately, and thereby corrupting Spanish Catholic society from within. This was not a purely invented anxiety. Some converso families did maintain private Jewish or Islamic practices, but the Inquisition's methods for distinguishing genuine converts from insincere ones were not subtle, and its definition of suspicious behaviour expanded rapidly once the machinery was operational. You could be denounced by a neighbour with a grudge, You could be accused by a business rival. You could be brought in for questioning because you didn't eat pork, or because you washed your hands before eating, or because you had lit candles on a Friday evening, or because someone had once seen you stand facing a certain direction when you prayed. Once accused, you were presumed guilty in a manner that made the presumption of innocence look like a foreign concept, which at that time and in that place it more or less was. You were not told the names of your accusers. You were not always told the specific charges against you. You were encouraged to confess, and if your confession did not match what your interrogators already believed, you were encouraged more persuasively. Torture was not used in every case. The Inquisition had procedural rules, and it was, in its own way, bureaucratic, but it was used in a significant number of cases, and it was used systematically enough to produce confessions of any shape the interrogators required. The most common method was the strappado, in which the accused was suspended by the wrists bound behind the back and dropped sharply, stopping before hitting the ground. This dislocated the shoulders reliably. It was considered moderate. There were less moderate options. Those found guilty faced a range of punishments: public humiliation, confiscation of property, imprisonment, or execution. Executions were performed at public ceremonies called auto da fe, acts of faith, in which sentences were read aloud before crowds, and the condemned were handed to civil authorities for the actual burning, since the church was technically not supposed to shed blood. This distinction was meaningful to the people who drew it. It was less meaningful to the people being burned. Isabella attended auto da fe. She considered them an expression of her faith and her duty. The smoke rising over Spanish cities during her reign was, to her, the smell of a kingdom being purified. To everyone else within breathing distance, it was something else entirely. She came to France as a 14-year-old Italian bride, married a prince who was already in love with someone else, and spent the next decade being mostly ignored in a court that didn't particularly care about her. Catherine de' Medici, born into the most powerful banking family in Europe and raised in the sophisticated, brutal world of Italian Renaissance politics, was not built for being ignored. She outlived her husband. She outlived several of her children. She served as regent of France not once but twice, and along the way she earned a reputation for political manipulation so complete and so ruthless that the French coined a word, Machiavellism, partly in reference to her methods. The poison accusations were almost certainly exaggerated. The body count, however, was not. The poison reputation attached to Catherine early and stuck with impressive tenacity. She was Italian, which to the French court was already suspicious, and she had brought Italian perfumers and apothecaries to France with her, which seemed to confirm every anxiety. The Florentines, as a general cultural reputation, were associated with sophisticated forms of murder, partly because of genuine Medici history, partly because of a French tendency to explain things they didn't understand by attributing them to Italian cunning. When inconvenient people at the French court died, the whispers started. The whispers accumulated. By the end of her life, Catherine de' Medici was being accused of murders that had taken place decades apart, in different countries, under entirely different circumstances, because she was the connecting thread, and because the narrative had taken on a life of its own. The reality of Catherine's political methods was considerably less dramatic than poison, and considerably more exhausting. She was a negotiator. She was a mediator. She was a woman trying to hold a France that was tearing itself apart along religious lines. Catholic against Huguenot. Noble faction against noble faction. Spanish influence against domestic independence, while simultaneously raising 10 children, managing a court of several thousand people, and trying to prevent any one party from gaining enough power to make the others declare open war. She mostly failed at this last goal, but she tried with a persistence that deserves at least a footnote. Her tool of choice was the marriage alliance, which she deployed with the focus of someone playing three-dimensional chess in a room where most of the other players were actively trying to flip the board. She married her children into every major royal house in Europe she could reach. She arranged matches, dissolved engagements, facilitated negotiations, and moved through the landscape of European dynastic politics like someone who had learned very early that a woman with no army of her own had better have very good relationships with the people who had armies. She was right about this. It kept her relevant for decades in a court that would have preferred she stay decorative. What she could not manage in the end was the religious war. France's Huguenots and Catholics had been bleeding each other since the 1560s, and every compromise Catherine engineered lasted only until the next provocation. She believed in neither faith strongly enough to simply pick a side and let the other burn, which might have been principled or might have been political and was probably both. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, which we will get to very shortly, was the moment when whatever control she thought she had over the situation demonstrated definitively that she had none. She lived 26 more years after that night. She never stopped trying to govern. She also never escaped its shadow. It is one of the bloodiest nights in European history. The 24th of August, 1572, when Catholic mobs, with at least the tacit approval of the French crown, killed somewhere between 5,000 and 30,000 Huguenot Protestants in a single night, starting in Paris and spreading across the country over the following weeks. Catherine de' Medici's exact role in ordering or enabling the massacre has been debated by historians ever since. What is generally agreed upon is this: she was present, she was informed, and she did not stop it. Whether she initiated it, lost control of something smaller she had authorized, or simply watched a powder keg detonate after years of her own political brinkmanship is a question the historical record refuses to answer cleanly. The weeks leading up to the massacre had been, on the surface, celebratory. Catherine had arranged the marriage of her daughter Margaret of Valois to the Protestant Henry of Navarre, a union designed to symbolize reconciliation between France's warring religious factions, the kind of diplomatic masterstroke she had spent her career attempting. Thousands of Huguenot noblemen had come to Paris for the wedding, which meant that the city contained, in the days immediately after the ceremony, the largest concentration of Protestant leadership in France. Whether Catherine understood what that meant before the killing started or only after is the question everything else depends on. Several days after the wedding, an assassination attempt on the Huguenot Admiral Gaspard de Coligny failed, wounding him rather than killing him. Coligny was the most powerful Protestant military leader in France and a close advisor to the young King Charles IX. His survival created an immediate crisis. If the Huguenots investigated the attempt, they would find it led back to the Guise family, who were Catherine's allies. If they didn't investigate and simply retaliated, France would be in open civil war within the week. Catherine, facing either outcome, apparently made a decision. The precise nature of that decision is where historians have been arguing for 450 years. What followed was systematic. In the early hours of the 24th, the bells of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois rang, the agreed signal, and Catholic militia moved through Paris with lists of addresses. Coligny was killed first, his body thrown from his own window. Then the killing spread outward through the city, block by block, into neighbourhoods, into houses, into hiding places that someone had known to identify. The Huguenots who had come to Paris for a wedding died in the streets they had walked to reach it. The Seine ran red for days, a phrase that sounds like rhetoric, until you consider that the population of Paris at that time was several 100,000 people, and the bodies had to go somewhere. The killing continued in the provinces for weeks, as local Catholic populations took the Paris massacre as royal permission for violence they had been suppressing. The total death toll has never been established with precision. The lower estimates are horrifying. The higher estimates are almost incomprehensible. King Charles Nifane, 19 years old, reportedly watched from a palace window and was said to have fired his own arquebus into the fleeing crowds below. Whether that detail is true or legend, the image it creates captures something real about the atmosphere. A city that had licensed itself to kill and found the license intoxicating. Catherine survived the massacre politically in the short term. She survived it personally for another 17 years. She did not survive its reputation, which followed her into every subsequent negotiation and coloured every judgment made about her afterward. When she died in 1589, her son Henry III reportedly received the news without visible grief, and commented that he was surprised she had lasted as long as she did. The court, by all accounts, agreed. She is often taught as one of history's great enlightened monarchs, the Habsburg Empress who modernised Austria, reformed the tax system, built schools, and ruled for 40 years with a combination of iron will and genuine administrative brilliance. All of that is true. What is less frequently mentioned is that Maria Theresa harboured a visceral hatred of Jewish people, that she acted on with the full force of imperial policy, expelling Jews from Prague in 1744 and from Vienna again in 1747, causing enormous suffering to communities that had been present for generations. She also established a chastity commission, an actual government body, tasked with arresting women suspected of sexual immorality and, in some cases, forcibly deporting them. The Enlightenment apparently had limits. Maria Theresa came to power in 1740 at the age of 23, inheriting the Habsburg dominions under the Pragmatic Sanction, a legal instrument her father Charles VI had spent decades persuading European monarchs to recognise. The moment he died, several of those monarchs decided they had not been as persuaded as they had indicated, and the War of the Austrian Succession began within months. Maria Theresa faced it pregnant, without a trained army, without a full treasury, and without the political experience that male heirs were routinely given as preparation for exactly this situation. She asked the Hungarian nobility for military support, appeared before their assembly with her infant son, and gave a speech so effective that the Hungarians voted her an army on the spot. It was one of the most impressive political performances of the 18th century, and she did it while postpartum. The 40 years that followed were genuinely reforming in ways that mattered. She created a centralised bureaucracy, standardised legal codes, abolished torture in most criminal proceedings, built schools across her territories with the specific goal of increasing literacy among her subjects, and reformed the military into something capable of defending the empire it was supposed to represent. Her son Joseph, who would later rule as Joseph III, was the more radical Enlightenment reformer of the two, but the foundations he built on were hers. She was not a woman who needed to be told that institutions required maintenance, but the Chastity Commission, formerly the Chastity Police, established in Vienna in the 1740s, was Maria Theresa's own invention, and it operated with an enthusiasm that reflected her genuine personal convictions about morality and order. Officers raided coffee houses, theatres and private homes. Women found in the company of men to whom they were not married were arrested. Some were imprisoned. Some were publicly flogged. Some were deported from Vienna on carts, their supposed crime announced on a sign around their neck. The Commission targeted poor women disproportionately, as these systems always do, and operated with enough arbitrary power to destroy a woman's reputation and livelihood on the word of a single informer. Her treatment of Jewish communities was, if anything, more directly personal. She described Jewish people in private correspondence with a contempt that was not incidental but systematic, calling them a plague and arguing that their removal from her territories was a religious and civic necessity. The expulsion she ordered caused genuine mass suffering. Thousands of people were displaced from communities their families had inhabited for centuries, with little warning and no compensation. When pressed by advisers on the economic damage the expulsions caused, Jewish merchants and financiers were essential to Habsburg commerce, in ways that could not simply be replaced. She accepted some modifications but never abandoned the underlying hostility. She was, in this, a product of her faith and her century. She was also, in this, the empress. Both things were true, and the people she expelled experienced both with equal force. She took the throne of Madagascar in 1828, under circumstances that were, at minimum, extremely suspicious, and held it for 33 years by methods that left very little room for ambiguity. Queen Ranavalona I expelled all European missionaries, banned Christianity under pain of death, killed or enslaved those who converted, and presided over population losses so severe, through executions, forced labour, and the practice of the Tangina trial, a poison ordeal used to determine guilt, that Madagascar's population may have declined by half during her reign. She was fiercely anti-colonial at a time when colonialism was consuming the rest of Africa, and some modern scholars have tried to rehabilitate her on those grounds. The people who survived her trial by poison have views that are harder to rehabilitate. Ranavalona came to power following the death of her husband, King Radamanth I, whose reign had been characterized by deliberate openness to European influence. Missionaries were welcomed, trade was expanded, and the London Missionary Society had established a significant presence on the island. Radama died in 1828, young and without a clear successor. Within hours of his death, Ranavalona's supporters had moved against the potential rival claimants, killing several members of the royal family in a palace coup that was brisk, organised, and almost certainly premeditated. She was declared queen by the Royal Assembly. Those who might have objected were no longer in a position to do so. Her rejection of European influence was immediate and total. Within years she had expelled the missionaries, forbidden Malagasy subjects from converting to Christianity, and declared that Madagascar would return to its traditional religion and governance structures, specifically to her governance structures, which were not subject to oversight by anyone who remained alive. The expulsion of Europeans was not irrational in its strategic logic. Colonialism was advancing across Africa with a momentum that would leave very few kingdoms standing by the end of the century, and rulers who had welcomed European presence often found that welcome becoming a foothold and then a takeover. Ranavalona saw what was happening on the continent and chose a different path. The path she chose, however, was not simply independence. It was a reign of terror that consumed her own people with the same thoroughness it repelled foreign influence. Forced labour, fanompona, was deployed on a scale that killed workers through exhaustion, disease, and violence. Roads and palaces were built on the bodies of the people who built them, and the people had no legal recourse and no right of refusal. Military campaigns against internal dissent were conducted with a brutality that left entire regions depopulated. The population of Madagascar, estimated at around 5 million at the start of her reign, may have fallen to around 2.5 million by her death in 1861. The numbers are disputed by historians, but none of the disputes suggest a comfortable revision downward. She was beloved by some of her subjects, which requires acknowledging. She was a Malagasy ruler maintaining Malagasy sovereignty in a world that was systematically ending such things, and that genuinely mattered. The French, who had their own designs on Madagascar, found her maddening, and eventually resorted to military force after she refused every diplomatic approach. She defeated the French expeditionary force in 1829, a military victory that was, in its context, extraordinary. She was not simply a monster. She was a complicated sovereign who did monstrous things with the same conviction she brought to everything else. The Tangina was a nut from a native Madagascan plant, highly toxic, reliably fatal in sufficient doses, and Ranavalona used it as the cornerstone of her justice system. If you were accused of a crime, sorcery, disloyalty, or simply being inconvenient, you were brought before the court and required to swallow the Tangina nut, along with 3 pieces of chicken skin. If you vomited up all 3 pieces of skin, you were innocent. If you didn't, you were guilty, or, more commonly, dead. The ordeal was performed not just on adults accused of crimes, but on infants suspected of being born on unlucky days, on entire villages swept up in accusations, and on anyone whose continued existence the Queen found inconvenient. Estimates suggest that between 15 and 20% of the Malagasy population died as a direct result of the Tangina during her reign. To understand the Tangina ordeal, you have to understand that it was not invented by Ranavalona. It had existed in Malagasy traditional justice long before her reign, as a method of determining guilt in cases where evidence was ambiguous, the idea being that the gods would protect the innocent and condemn the guilty through the body's response to the poison. This is the kind of logic that sounds defensible until you consider that the tangina nut is toxic to everyone regardless of moral standing, and that the body's ability to vomit up 3 specific pieces of chicken skin within the required window has no meaningful relationship to whether you did the thing you were accused of doing. What Ranavalona did was scale it. Under her reign, the tangina was not an exceptional measure reserved for serious and genuinely unresolvable cases. It became a routine administrative tool deployed with a frequency that turned a marginal survival into a mass execution mechanism. Denunciations multiplied because denunciation was encouraged, and accusers faced no penalty for being wrong. The ordeal would sort things out. Entire communities were subjected to the tangina when a single accusation of witchcraft or disloyalty was made against one of their members. The poison did not distinguish between the accused and the bystanders. The survival rate varied depending on dosage, the physical condition of the person being tested, and factors that had nothing to do with guilt or innocence. Some people survived through luck. Some survived because the dose they received was insufficient. Some survived because they were physically robust enough to vomit quickly and completely. The people administering the ordeal were not neutral parties. They had relationships, loyalties, and occasionally financial interests in specific outcomes, and the amount of tangina given to a specific person on a specific day could reflect those interests without anyone having to say so explicitly. It was a justice system with a built-in mechanism for murder that was entirely deniable, because the poison made it official. Ranavalona applied the tangina to suspected Christians with particular enthusiasm after Christianity was banned. If you were accused of secretly practicing the forbidden faith, the ordeal awaited. Many people died this way. Many more died in the executions that followed a failed ordeal, which included burning, drowning, being thrown from cliff tops, or being boiled alive. Methods whose variety suggested a degree of creativity about cruelty that went somewhat beyond the purely administrative. She ruled this way for 33 years. When she died in 1861 at somewhere around 83 years of age, her son Radama II immediately abolished the tangina, welcomed the missionaries back, and reopened Madagascar to European contact. The pendulum swung so far and so fast in the other direction that it created its own disasters. But the immediate relief was unmistakable. She was a Hungarian noblewoman of extraordinary wealth and rank, educated, multilingual, and by contemporary accounts, genuinely beautiful, which is mentioned here only because it was apparently what gave her the idea. Elizabeth Bathory, Countess of Sejt, believed, or came to believe, or simply told herself she believed, that the blood of young women kept her skin youthful. She began by employing young peasant girls as servants. She ended by the accounts of over 300 witnesses and her own servants' confessions, having tortured and killed somewhere between 80 and 650 young women, most of them girls between the ages of 10 and 14. She was never formally tried. She was bricked into her own bedchamber and left there to die. She lived for 3 more years. Elizabeth Bathory was born in 1560 into one of the most powerful noble families in Hungary, a family whose members had included kings, cardinals, and military commanders of genuine distinction. Her upbringing was, by the standards of her class and era, excellent. She was educated in multiple languages, trained in estate management, and by her early teens was already being prepared for the kind of advantageous marriage that would consolidate her family's political position. She married Ferenc Nadasti in 1575 at age 15. He was 25, a celebrated military commander known as the Black Knight of Hungary, and by most accounts a reasonably decent husband for the standards of the time, which admittedly is setting the bar at ankle height. The violence appears to have begun gradually, as these things often do. Servants who displeased her were punished physically, which was legal and not unusual for a noblewoman of her rank. The punishments became more severe. The servants became younger. Nadasti, who was frequently away on military campaigns, was reportedly either unaware of what was happening or aware and uninterested in stopping it. Accounts differ, and he died in 1604 before the worst of it came to official attention. After his death, the castle at Sejte became Elizabeth's primary residence, and whatever restraints had existed seemed to have dissolved with her husband's presence. The testimonies collected during the investigation of 1610 and 11, which involved over 300 witnesses, including surviving servants, local clergy, and regional administrators, describe torture methods whose variety and specificity suggest not spontaneous cruelty, but something organised, habitual, and long practised. Girls were beaten, burned, bitten, frozen in outdoor pens during winter, held in stress positions for extended periods, had their skin cut and burned with candles, and were in some cases starved or bled to death. The blood-bathing legend, which became the most famous element of her story, may or may not have been literally practised. Some historians believe it was added to the account later to emphasise her vanity and monstrousness. But the killing itself was not in dispute. The bodies had been buried in gardens, thrown over walls, dumped in pits. She was arrested in 1610 by her own cousin, Count Georgi Thurso, the Palatine of Hungary, who arrived at Chait Castle and reportedly found the evidence immediately and in plain sight. She was confined to her chambers. A noble woman of her rank and political connections could not simply be tried and executed without consequences that the Hungarian nobility was not prepared to manage, and remained there until her death in 1614. She was found dead by a guard, lying face down on the floor of her room. She was 54 years old. The chamber had been sealed around her for 4 years. One of the most quietly horrifying aspects of the Bathory case is not the Countess herself, but the people around her, the servants, the assistants, the women who helped. 4 members of her household staff were arrested along with her, tried, convicted, and executed for their participation. They had been with her for years. They had watched. They had helped. They had recruited. One theory is that they were afraid of her. Another is that complicity, in a household with that much power and that much isolation, had its own terrible logic. In a world where servants had no legal standing, no recourse, and no way out, some of them participated in evil, not because they were evil themselves, but because the alternative was becoming the next victim. That distinction does not absolve them. It just makes the whole thing more unbearable. The 4 principal accomplices named in the proceedings were Ilona Jo, Dorothea Sentes, Janos Fichko, and Katerina Benica. Ilona Jo and Dorothea Sentes were older women who had served in the Bathory household for years. Ilona had been Elizabeth's wet nurse. They were the ones who recruited girls from local villages, promising employment and wages at the Countess's estate, which was considered a reasonable opportunity for a peasant family with a daughter to place. They brought the girls in. They knew what they were bringing them to. They continued doing it for years. Fichko was a manservant who assisted in the physical aspects of the torture and disposal. Benica was convicted on what appear to have been slightly lesser charges and received a lesser sentence, suggesting she was considered a participant rather than an organiser. At trial, all 4 confessed. The confessions were obtained under torture, which complicates their evidentiary value in ways that 16th century Hungarian courts were not particularly concerned about. Whether the confessions were accurate in their details, or shaped by interrogation into the form the investigators required, is a question that cannot be fully resolved. What is clear is that the participation of Elizabeth's household in what happened at Chejde was not disputed by anyone, including the participants themselves when they were caught. The question of why they continued is not answered by the trial record. Fear is the obvious explanation. Bathory was a powerful noblewoman, and they were servants with no legal recourse and no realistic avenue of escape. A servant who attempted to report a powerful employer faced consequences that could include death, and death at Chejde was demonstrably available. But fear does not fully account for years of active participation. of recruiting new victims, of covering the evidence. At some point, the people around Elizabeth Bathory became participants in something larger than fear, complicit not through a single terrible decision, but through the accumulated weight of hundreds of small ones, each one making the next slightly easier to make. This is not an unusual pattern. The architecture of atrocity tends to require staff. The people who run the day-to-day operations of evil are rarely as iconic as the person at the top, but they are always there. And the question of what they tell themselves to get through the work is one of the more uncomfortable questions history puts to us on a regular basis. Ilona Joe and Dorothea Sentes had their fingers cut off before they were burned alive. Fitchko was beheaded. Benikar was imprisoned. The sentences were proportional to assessed guilt. None of them, in the record, expressed anything that reads as genuine remorse for the girls. That silence is its own kind of answer. When the Byzantine Empress Irene of Athens seized power in 797, she did not simply depose her son, Constantine VI, the rightful emperor. She had him blinded, a practice used in Byzantine politics to render a rival incapable of ruling, since convention held that a physically impaired man could not sit on the throne. The blinding was carried out, according to sources, in the very room where Irene had given birth to him. Constantine did not die immediately, though he lost most of his sight and vanished from the historical record shortly afterward, which historians interpret with grim pragmatism. Irene then ruled alone, the first woman to hold the title of Byzantine Emperor, not Empress, Emperor, in her own right. She was eventually deposed, exiled, and forced to support herself by spinning wool. History contains multitudes. Irene came to Constantinople as a teenager from Athens in 769, selected as a bride for the young Emperor Constantine V's son Leo. She was, by the accounts that survive, beautiful, intelligent, and almost entirely without political allies in the city she had been imported to inhabit. The Byzantine court was one of the most intricate and lethal political environments in the medieval world, a place where emperors were regularly deposed by their own generals, relatives, or court factions, and where the distance between the throne and a convent or a dungeon was measured in hours rather than years. Irene spent her early years at court learning this landscape with the attention of someone who understood that ignorance was not a survivable option. Her husband Leo IV died in 780, leaving Irene as regent for their 10-year-old son Constantine VI. The regency was supposed to be temporary, a holding arrangement until Constantine came of age and assumed full imperial authority. Irene treated it as a career. She cultivated relationships with the military, managed the church with the kind of attentive diplomacy that kept powerful ecclesiastical figures feeling respected and therefore cooperative, and made herself, over the course of a decade, central to the functioning of the Byzantine state, in ways that would not be easy to remove. Constantine, growing into young adulthood, became increasingly resentful of his mother's dominance. He attempted to assert independent authority, clashed with her over political appointments, and in 790 managed to depose her temporarily, exiling her to her palace. She was back within 2 years. Their relationship deteriorated into something that historians describe diplomatically as deeply dysfunctional, and that anyone with a family would recognize as mutual incompatibility, weaponized by proximity to absolute power. By 797, Constantine had made enough enemies through a series of military failures and political miscalculations that Irene's faction was able to move against him with enough support to make the coup stick. He was arrested, brought to the palace, and blinded in the Purple Chamber, the room reserved for imperial births, the room where he had been born. The symbolism was deliberate. Irene, who had given him life in that room, was removing his capacity for rule in the same space. It was the kind of gesture that the Byzantine court, which appreciated theatre in its politics, would have understood immediately. She ruled for 5 years as sole emperor, and her reign included the restoration of icon veneration, a significant theological policy reversal that earned her the title saint in the Eastern Orthodox Church, which is an extraordinary thing for a woman who had just blinded her son to be called. The Church, in this as in other things, made its own calculations about which deeds to foreground. She was deposed in 802 by her finance minister Nikephoros, who sent her to the island of Lesbos and then to the island of Samos, where she died the following year. She had apparently been spinning wool to support herself in exile. The woman who had ruled the Eastern Roman Empire in her own name ended her days at a loom. The irony is either magnificent or devastating, depending on your disposition. She entered the Forbidden City at 16 as a low-ranking imperial concubine, one of dozens selected from across China to serve the Xianfeng emperor. By the time she was done, 50 years later, having ruled China as regent twice, and as the supreme power behind the throne almost continuously, she had overseen the decline of a dynasty, the suppression of multiple uprisings, the disastrous Boxer Rebellion, and a foreign policy so erratic that 8 major world powers invaded Beijing simultaneously. She also modernized China in fits and starts, abolished the practice of binding women's feet, reformed the examination system, and built a marble boat at the Summer Palace using money earmarked for the navy, which is either eccentric or a war crime depending on how you count the sailors who subsequently died. She was complicated. She was also ruthless in ways that make the marble boat feel like the least of it. Cixi was born in 1835 into a Manchu family of middling rank. Comfortable enough, not remotely positioned for imperial proximity. She entered the Forbidden City in 1851 through the standard selection process for imperial concubines, which involved regional examinations, physical inspections, and evaluations of character and education that were, in their way, intensely competitive. She was selected. She was given a low rank. She was one of many. The Forbidden City in 1851 contained thousands of women in various grades of imperial favour, and the distance from a low-ranking concubine to genuine power was not a distance most of them were expected to cross. Cixi crossed it because she bore the emperor's son, his only surviving male heir as it turned out, which transformed her position overnight from ornamental to essential. When Xianfeng died in 1861, the son Cixi had given him was 5 years old. She was 26. The regency that was formally established named her and the primary empress Qian as co-regents, alongside a council of 8 senior officials appointed by the dying emperor specifically to prevent either woman from dominating the government. Within months, Cixi had organised a coup against the council with the help of the emperor's brother Prince Gong, had the council members arrested, and had herself and Qian established as the actual authorities of the empire. She was 26 years old, and she had just outmanoeuvred 8 of the most experienced political operators in the Qing dynasty, before most of them fully understood what was happening. The 50 years that followed were marked by the particular combination of personal acuity and institutional rigidity that defines the decline of dynasties. Cixi understood people. She understood courts, factions, loyalty, and fear. She did not understand the Industrial Revolution, or perhaps she understood it too late, or perhaps she understood it and couldn't move a system that resisted movement. China was losing ground to foreign powers in ways that required structural change, and structural change threatened the aristocratic and bureaucratic interests that Cixi depended on for support. So reform happened slowly, incompletely, and usually reversed before it took root. The Boxer Rebellion of 1900, an anti-foreign uprising that Cixi catastrophically decided to support, resulted in 8 foreign nations marching their armies to Beijing. Cixi fled the capital in a cart disguised as a peasant. She returned a year later and spent her remaining years negotiating the terms of her dynasty's survival, which proved temporary. She died in 1908, one day after the Guangxu emperor whose imprisonment she had arranged, and whose arsenic-poisoning forensic evidence suggests she organised. She had chosen her successor, a 3-year-old child, and issued her final edicts from her deathbed. She was 72 years old, and had been the most powerful person in China for most of half a century. The dynasty she had propped up survived her by 3 years. Emperor Guangxu was Cixi's nephew, She had placed him on the throne herself when the previous emperor died without an heir. For most of his reign, he was emperor in name and her puppet in practice, which he eventually tired of in 1898 when he attempted a series of sweeping modernization reforms known as the 100 Days Reform. Cixi crushed the reforms, placed Guangxu under house arrest on an island in the middle of a lake in the imperial garden, and had the reformers he had worked with arrested and executed, 6 of them beheaded in a single afternoon. Guangxu remained a prisoner in the most beautiful prison in China for the next decade. When Cixi died in 1908, Guangxu died the day before her. The official cause was listed as natural causes. Modern forensic testing on his hair found lethal levels of arsenic. Guangxu had been placed on the throne in 1875 at the age of 4 after the death of his cousin the Tongji Emperor. He was Cixi's nephew through her sister, which made him blood adjacent to the imperial line without being the obvious successor. There were other candidates with stronger claims, but Cixi selected Guangxu because a 4-year-old was manageable in ways that adult princes are not. She had him formally adopted by the late Xianfeng Emperor, which gave him the necessary imperial lineage, and she continued as regent while he grew up inside the Forbidden City, under supervision that was total without being obviously imprisoning. He was educated, treated well, given the ceremony and ritual of imperial life. He simply had no actual power. When Guangxu began his personal rule in 1889, officially assuming full imperial authority at age 17, the arrangement was supposed to change. Cixi was supposed to retire. She retired to the Summer Palace, which was close enough to Beijing that she could be back in hours, and maintained informal influence through the networks she had spent decades building. The retirement was, to anyone paying attention, theoretical. When Guangxu moved toward genuine reform in 1898, working with the scholar Kang Yuwei on a comprehensive modernization program covering education, the military, the bureaucracy, and the economy, Cixi watched from the Summer Palace and waited for the moment to move. The 100 Days Reform lasted 103 days. Cixi returned to Beijing, reassumed power, and the Guangxu Emperor was escorted to the Ocean Terrace, a pavilion on an artificial island in the middle of Zhongnanhai Lake, which sounds romantic until you understand that the bridge to the island was guarded and he was not permitted to leave. He lived there for the next 10 years in a confinement that was comfortable by the standards of confinement and intolerable by the standards of being the nominal emperor of China. He was allowed his books, his music, and his astronomical instruments. He was allowed almost nothing else. Visitors who saw him in the later years of his imprisonment described a man who appeared physically deteriorated and deeply melancholy, thin, withdrawn, his health declining in ways that seemed to go beyond simple illness. He was 37 when he died. Cixi died the following day, having apparently arranged everything to her satisfaction. The forensic testing conducted in 2008 on samples from his remains found arsenic levels approximately 2,000 times higher than the normal range. Arsenic poisoning produces symptoms consistent with what witnesses described in his final weeks. The timing of his death, the day before Cixi, ensuring he could not undo anything she had arranged, is a detail that does not require elaboration. Mary, Queen of Scots, is one of history's great tragic figures, which is a polite way of saying she was a genuinely capable woman who made a series of spectacular decisions that individually might have been survivable and collectively were not. She was crowned Queen of Scotland before she turned 1-year-old. She was sent to France at age 5, raised at the most sophisticated court in Europe, and returned to Scotland at 18 to find a country that had become Protestant in her absence, deeply suspicious of its Catholic queen, and already half convinced she was going to be a problem. She then married badly, twice, got implicated, fairly or not, in the murder of her second husband, and eventually ended up imprisoned by her own cousin, Queen Elizabeth I of England, for 19 years before being executed in 1587 at age 44. She wore red to the execution, the colour of martyrdom. It was, everyone agreed, an extraordinary exit. Mary Stuart was born in 1542, 6 days before her father James V of Scotland died, a timing that was, depending on your perspective, either terrible luck or a preview of a life in which circumstances conspired against her with unusual consistency. Her regency was fought over immediately. Scotland in the 1540s was being pulled between England, which wanted her married to the young Edward VI, and the two kingdoms united under English dominance, and France, which wanted her secured in the French alliance. France won. Mary was sent to the French court at age 5, where she was educated alongside the French royal children, grew up speaking French as her primary language, and was in every cultural sense shaped by one of the most sophisticated environments in the world. She married the French Dauphin Francis in 1558. He became King Francis II of France in 1559. He died in 1560, 16 years old, leaving Mary a widow at 18 and suddenly without a country that wanted her. France had a new king and a new queen mother in Catherine de' Medici, who had never been enthusiastic about her daughter-in-law's influence, and Mary's position at the French court evaporated with the same speed her husband had. She returned to Scotland in 1561 to a country she had not lived in since childhood, and did not, in any meaningful cultural sense, know. Scotland was now officially Protestant, governed by a council deeply influenced by John Knox, a reformer who had written a pamphlet titled The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women, the monstrous regiment being, in his usage, the rule of women, which he considered against natural law. He met Mary several times. Their conversations were, by all accounts, spectacularly unpleasant. Mary was Catholic, French in manner, young, and determined to rule, every one of which qualities was a problem in the Scotland she had returned to, and she had all four simultaneously. Her first marriage in Scotland to her cousin Lord Darnley in 1565 was impulsive and strategically disastrous. Darnley was vain, jealous, and politically inept. His behaviour alienated the Scottish nobles whose support Mary needed, and his jealousy of her secretary David Rizzio culminated in Rizzio being murdered in Mary's presence, in her own supper room, while she was pregnant. She did not forgive this. What she did instead was worse, though historians have argued about exactly how much worse and in what direction for 400 years. Mary's second husband, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, was found dead in the garden of Kirk of Field House in Edinburgh on the 10th of February 1567. The house had been blown up with gunpowder overnight. Darnley was found outside, strangled, which meant either he had escaped the explosion and been killed afterward, or the explosion had been a distraction, and the strangling was the actual plan, or both, or neither. The man widely suspected of organising the murder was the Earl of Bothwell, who was acquitted in a trial so obviously rigged that the prosecution witnesses were too afraid to appear. 3 months later, Mary married Bothwell. Whatever she knew and whatever she did, marrying the lead suspect in your husband's murder within 90 days of the murder is, historically speaking, not a great look. The night of the explosion has been reconstructed by historians with a thoroughness that produces more questions than answers. Kirk-o-Field was a house on the outskirts of Edinburgh where Darnley had been staying while recovering from what was described as smallpox, though some historians have suggested syphilis, which would have been recorded as something else for reasons of court dignity. Mary had visited him that evening and left, reportedly to attend a masque at Holyrood Palace. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, a massive explosion destroyed the house. Darnley and his valet were found in the garden, in their nightshirts, with no visible injuries from the blast, strangled. They had apparently gotten out before the explosion and been caught by someone waiting in the garden, which suggests the gunpowder was either a backup plan or a distraction, and either way implies a level of organisational thinking that goes well beyond a single impulsive act. The investigation was conducted in the atmosphere you would expect from a 16th century Scottish court in which everyone with a motive was also someone with enough power to interfere with the proceedings. Bothwell, who had been Mary's ally and was by this point clearly her close companion, was tried and acquitted within a few weeks in circumstances that contemporary observers described as a farce performed with straight faces. Nobody credible testified against him. Nobody credible was willing to. Edinburgh had the atmosphere of a city that knew things it was not prepared to say publicly, which is the atmosphere that produces very bad outcomes for queens who do not distance themselves from the situation immediately. Mary did not distance herself. 3 months after her husband's murder, she married Bothwell, after Bothwell had, by several accounts, abducted her and possibly assaulted her, though whether the abduction was genuine or a staged justification for a marriage that both parties wanted is something historians have never resolved. The marriage destroyed whatever remained of her political position in Scotland. The Scottish nobles, who had tolerated a great deal, drew the line at their queen marrying the man they believed had blown up her previous husband. They raised an army. Mary surrendered at Carberry Hill in June 1567 without a battle. Bothwell fled the country and eventually died in a Danish prison, reportedly insane, chained to a post. He had been, in every measurable way, catastrophic for Mary. She was imprisoned at Lochleven Castle, forced to abdicate in favour of her infant son James, and miscarried twins, Bothwell's children, during her imprisonment. She escaped in 1568, raised a small army, lost the subsequent battle at Langside, and made the decision that ended her freedom permanently. She crossed into England and threw herself on the mercy of her cousin Elizabeth VI. Elizabeth's mercy turned out to be a very comfortable house arrest that lasted 19 years. Mary spent those years plotting, writing letters, and being the focal point of every Catholic conspiracy against Elizabeth that Europe could generate, which eventually gave Elizabeth the justification she had been waiting for, and in 1587 the axe came down. It took 3 strokes. Mary's dog, which had been hidden under her skirts, was found beside her body, and reportedly refused to leave. She was the daughter of a general, the sister of an emperor, the wife of an emperor, and the mother of an emperor, and none of those men, with the possible exception of the last one, was more dangerous than she was. Agrippina the Younger, born in 15 AD, navigated the bloodbath of the early Roman imperial court with a precision that her contemporaries found terrifying, and her historians have found fascinating ever since. She survived the reign of Caligula, her brother, who exiled her after accusing her of conspiracy. She married her uncle, the Emperor Claudius, which required a change in Roman law specifically to make it legal, and then, according to most ancient sources, poisoned him with mushrooms at a state dinner when he became inconvenient. Then she made her son Nero emperor. Then Nero had her killed. Nobody in this family did anything simply. Agrippina was born into the Julio-Claudian dynasty at its most unstable, a family line in which natural causes of death were treated with widespread skepticism, and the dinner table was considered a tactical environment. Her father was Germanicus, one of Rome's most celebrated generals, who died in suspicious circumstances when Agrippina was 13. Her mother, Agrippina the Elder, starved to death in exile after falling out with the Emperor Tiberius. 2 of her brothers died in prison. She grew up, in other words, with a very clear understanding of what happened to members of the imperial family who miscalculated, and she was determined not to miscalculate. Under Caligula, her brother and emperor, she navigated a court that was by any reasonable measure completely unhinged. Caligula's reign involved genuine cruelty, possible madness, and an atmosphere of terror that kept the Roman aristocracy in a state of constant anxious performance. Agrippina survived it until she didn't. She was accused of involvement in a conspiracy and exiled to the Pontine Islands in 39 AD, where she was forced to carry the ashes of her executed husband in her own hands as a form of humiliation. She was on those islands for 2 years, until Caligula was assassinated and her uncle Claudius became emperor, at which point she returned to Rome and began, with characteristic efficiency, repositioning herself. Her marriage to Claudius in 49 AD was the pivot point of her career. Claudius was a man whom the Roman aristocracy had spent decades underestimating. He had survived the Julio-Claudian bloodbaths partly by being considered too physically awkward and intellectually eccentric to be worth eliminating. but who had turned out to be a surprisingly capable administrator once he was actually emperor. He was also susceptible to the women around him in ways that made him both useful and manageable. Agrippina was his niece. The marriage required a legal dispensation, and the ancient sources record that the Senate passed the necessary law with a speed that suggested they understood who was really in charge of the request. Once married to Claudius, Agrippina moved with the precision of someone who had been planning this for years, which she probably had. She secured the adoption of her son Nero, born from her previous marriage, as Claudius's heir, displacing his own son Britannicus in the succession. She accumulated titles, honours, and visible symbols of power that no Roman woman had previously held. She appeared on coins alongside the emperor. She received foreign ambassadors. She sat beside Claudius at public events on a platform equal to his. She was not performing power, she was exercising it, openly, in a way that made Rome's traditional understanding of female roles deeply uncomfortable, which she appeared to find entirely acceptable. Claudius died in 54 AD, reportedly from poisoned mushrooms served at dinner. The mushroom story comes primarily from Tacitus and Suetonius, both writing decades later, both working with sources that had reasons to emphasize Agrippina's culpability. Whether she poisoned him, or whether he died of natural causes that she found timely, is uncertain. What is certain is that Nero became emperor immediately afterward, and Agrippina had spent years engineering exactly that outcome. For the first years of Nero's reign, Agrippina was in many ways the real power behind the throne. She had engineered his succession, marginalized his rivals, and positioned herself as co-ruler in all but formal title. Ancient coins from this period show her face on one side and Nero's on the other, an extraordinary symbol of shared imperial authority that had never been granted to a woman before. Then Nero, 19 years old and apparently tired of sharing, began to pull away. He fell under the influence of his tutor Seneca, his advisor Burrus, and a freed woman named Acte, with whom he was conducting an affair his mother disapproved of loudly and often. The pulling away was gradual. The murder was not gradual. Nero attempted to have his mother killed by a collapsing boat designed to sink. She swam to shore. He sent soldiers. They finished the job. When told she was dead, Nero reportedly asked to see the body and calmly evaluated it. He was 22 years old. The mechanism of Nero's assassination attempt on his mother was, even by the standards of first-century Rome, Baroque. A boat was specially constructed with a collapsing hull, a section of the deck designed to cave in and sink the vessel at a specific moment, ideally drowning Agrippina in what would appear to be an accident. She was invited to a festival at the Bay of Baiae and sent home on this boat. The mechanism triggered. The boat partially collapsed. Agrippina and her companion Acerronia fell into the water. Acerronia, attempting to attract rescue by calling out that she was Agrippina, was beaten to death by the oarsmen. Agrippina, who stayed quiet, swam to shore. She was a woman in her mid-40s who had just survived a mechanically engineered assassination attempt in the middle of a bay at night and swum to safety. The expression on Nero's face when he received the news that she had arrived home and sent him a message informing him of her narrow escape from what she was diplomatically describing as an accident is not recorded, but one imagines it was not serene. He sent 3 men, a naval commander named Anicetus and 2 others, to her villa. Agrippina reportedly heard them coming and met them with a composure that the ancient sources describe in terms suggesting they found it more unnerving than hysteria would have been. She reportedly told Anicetus that if he had come from her son, he should tell Nero she was well. If he had come for something else, she refused to believe her son could want her dead. It was either genuine denial or extraordinary theatre, and at this point in her life the two were probably indistinguishable. She was stabbed multiple times. Before she died, she reportedly directed the final blow to her own womb, the womb that had given Nero life, telling her killers to strike there. This detail appears in Tacitus and may be literary embellishment. but it has survived for 2,000 years because it captures something true about the relationship. She had made him, and he had unmade her, and she wanted that understood. Nero's explanation to the Senate was that Agrippina had been discovered plotting against him and had committed suicide when the plot was uncovered. The Senate, which had spent years watching Agrippina accumulate power and found it unsettling, accepted this explanation with a relief that Tacitus describes as undignified. They had always been uncomfortable with her. They were grateful for a version of events that did not require them to condemn their emperor for matricide, which would have been politically complicated. Nero, freed from his mother, ruled for another 9 years before being deposed and killing himself at 30. He had, by most ancient accounts, deteriorated rapidly and thoroughly without her. Whether that is causation or coincidence is something the historians have debated pleasantly ever since. Joan of Navarre was, by most historical accounts, a competent and largely benign queen consort who had managed the Duchy of Brittany capably as regent before marrying the English King Henry IV. She was well liked by her stepchildren. She was generous to her household. She was, by any reasonable measure, not a witch. And yet in 1419, some 2 years after Henry IV had died, and while his son Henry V was at war in France, and badly in need of money, Joan was arrested on charges of witchcraft and sorcery. Specifically, the accusation that she had attempted to kill the king by the most horrible means through necromancy and dark arts. She was imprisoned for nearly 3 years in Pevensey Castle. Her income and estates were seized and redirected to fund the war. When the money was no longer urgently needed, the charges quietly evaporated and she was released. She lived another 13 years. The witch accusation left quietly too, which tells you everything about what it actually was. Joan was born around 1370 as the daughter of Charles II of Navarre, a man known to history as Charles the Bad, which is a nickname that suggests the family had some experience with difficult reputations. She married John IV, Duke of Brittany, in 1386 and governed the duchy as regent after his death in 1409, with a competence that earned genuine respect from the Breton nobility, which was not a group given to distributing respect carelessly. She had 8 children, managed the duchy's finances, navigated the complex political relationships between Brittany, France and England, and then married Henry IV of England in 1403, becoming queen consort at a court that was, if not warm toward her, at least not actively hostile. Her relationship with her stepchildren was, by the standards of step-family relationships in the medieval English court, remarkably functional. The future Henry V treated her with apparent affection and respect during his father's lifetime, and in the early years of his own reign, she remained at the English court after Henry IV's death in 1413, without any immediate pressure to leave, which was not the universal experience of dowager queens in that period. She had her dower income, her household, her position. She was, in every visible way, living out a comfortable if politically peripheral widowhood. The arrest in 1419 came from a single accusation made by her own confessor, John Randolph, a friar who claimed she had attempted to harm Henry V through sorcery. The charge was specific enough to be credible and vague enough to be impossible to disprove, which is the ideal combination for a charge you intend to use as a legal instrument rather than an actual prosecution. Witchcraft accusations against women of wealth and rank, in this period, functioned reliably as tools of asset seizure. The accused's property was confiscated pending investigation. The investigation could be extended indefinitely, and the charges could be dropped whenever the political or financial need that had generated them had been satisfied. Joan was imprisoned at Pevensey Castle, and then at Leeds Castle, both comfortable enough by the standards of medieval imprisonment, which is to say she was not in a dungeon, but she was not free. Her income, amounting to several £1,000s per year, was redirected to the crown, and specifically to funding Henry's campaigns in France. She was held for nearly 3 years. In 1422, with the war in France going well enough that the immediate financial pressure had eased, Henry thus visited her in person, reportedly expressed regret for her treatment, restored her income and liberty, and ensured she lived comfortably for the remaining years of her life. She died in 1437, having outlived both the king who imprisoned her and the confessor who accused her. The Friar John Randolph, who had made the accusation, disappears from the record immediately after making it. He received no reward that history has been able to trace, and was not called upon to substantiate his charges in any formal proceeding. He may have been a genuine true believer who thought he was reporting something real. He may have been an instrument of someone who needed the Queen's income removed for a season. He may have been both, which is how these things usually work. Joan herself, when released, appears to have expressed no particular bitterness about the experience, or if she did, no one wrote it down, which amounts to the same thing in the historical record. Cleopatra VII has been called a seductress, a schemer, and a manipulator by everyone from ancient Roman historians with obvious political motives to generations of playwrights and filmmakers who found her complicated and decided to flatten her. The actual historical Cleopatra was the first ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty to bother learning Egyptian, a dynasty that had ruled Egypt for 250 years without speaking the language. She spoke 9 languages. She studied philosophy, mathematics, and military strategy. She was a mother, a naval commander, and a political survivor in a world that was actively trying to consume Egypt whole. She did have Ptolemy Thutmose, her younger brother and nominal co-ruler, killed. She probably had her sister Arsinoe executed. She also kept Egypt independent for 20 years after it should have become a Roman province, which was no small thing, and is usually underreported because she achieved it partly through relationships with men, and apparently history finds that more interesting than the outcome. Cleopatra was born around 69 BC into the Ptolemaic dynasty, a family of Macedonian Greek origin that had ruled Egypt since the death of Alexander the Great. The Ptolemies were, by the 1st century BC, a dynasty in significant trouble, weakened by generations of internal conflict, dependent on Roman goodwill to maintain their independence, and operating in a Mediterranean world that Rome was steadily absorbing. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy Theophene, had maintained his throne partly by paying enormous bribes to Roman political figures, a strategy that was effective in the short term and financially ruinous in the longer one. She grew up watching her father manage the humiliation of dependence on a power that could, at any moment, simply decide Egypt was more useful as a province than as a client kingdom. She came to the throne at around 18, jointly with her younger brother Ptolemy Theophene, whom she was also nominally married to in the Ptolemaic tradition of sibling co-rulership that the dynasty had maintained, and that everyone outside Egypt found baffling and unsettling. Ptolemy the Thethi was about 10 years old and controlled by a regency council whose members had their own agenda and who successfully forced Cleopatra into exile within 3 years of her accession. She was in the eastern desert raising an army when Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria in 48 BC, having followed his defeated rival Pompey to Egypt. Pompey was murdered on the Egyptian shore before Caesar arrived, which created a diplomatic crisis for the Egyptians and an opportunity for Cleopatra. The story of her arrival before Caesar, reportedly smuggled into the palace, rolled in a carpet or a linen sack, depending on the source, has been embellished so thoroughly by subsequent centuries that it has become almost impossible to evaluate. What is not embellished is the outcome. Caesar supported Cleopatra's claim against her brothers. The subsequent civil war ended with Ptolemy Thethi drowned in the Nile while retreating from battle, and Cleopatra was restored to her throne. She was 21 years old. She had executed a political gamble of considerable precision, and it had worked. Rome's most powerful man was now her ally, and shortly afterward, the father of her son Caesarion. Her relationship with Caesar was not a surrender to Roman power. It was an attempt to harness it. Egypt needed a powerful Roman patron to remain independent, and the most powerful Roman available had just arrived in her capital. The calculation was cold, and the affection may have been real, and both can be true simultaneously. which is something the Romans who wrote about her afterward preferred not to acknowledge, because it made her seem less like a seductress and more like a diplomat, which was considerably more threatening to their preferred version of events. When Julius Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March in 44 BC, Cleopatra was in Rome, staying at Caesar's villa, the mother of his son Caesarion, in a position of extraordinary personal exposure. Within weeks of the assassination, she was gone, back to Egypt, where she had her own precarious situation to manage. Caesar's death removed the single most powerful protector she had in the Roman world. It plunged Rome into civil war, which was bad for Egypt as a neighbour. It left Caesarion, her son and co-ruler, as a political liability, a child with a claim to Roman legitimacy that Rome's new power players found threatening and would spend years trying to neutralise. Cleopatra's subsequent relationship with Mark Antony was not simply a love affair, though it was apparently also that. It was an alliance, a strategy, and ultimately a bet on the wrong man in a war she needed to win. The years between Caesar's assassination and her alliance with Antony were among the most dangerous of Cleopatra's reign. Rome was tearing itself apart between Caesar's supporters and his assassins, and Egypt was positioned uncomfortably close to the conflict geographically, economically, and politically. Both sides wanted Egyptian resources, grain, money, ships, and both sides were capable of taking them by force if Egypt failed to be sufficiently cooperative. Cleopatra navigated this period by attempting to back the winning side without committing so firmly that she could not adjust if the winning side changed, which in the civil wars of the late Roman Republic it did with uncomfortable frequency. Mark Antony arrived in her political orbit in 41 BC, after the defeat of Caesar's assassins at Philippi. He was at that point the dominant power in the eastern half of the Roman world, confident, celebrated, and in need of Egyptian resources for his planned campaign against the Parthian Empire. He summoned Cleopatra to meet him at Tarsus, in a tone that suggested he expected deference. Cleopatra arrived on a gilded barge with purple sails and silver oars, attended by women dressed as sea nymphs, with herself appearing as Aphrodite. She was not performing submission. She was establishing that he had summoned a queen, and queens arrived on their own terms. Their alliance lasted a decade and produced 3 children. It also produced a political programme, the Donations of Alexandria in 34 BC, in which Antony formally assigned vast Roman territories to Cleopatra and her children, that gave Octavian, Caesar's heir and Antony's rival, exactly the propaganda he needed. Antony was abandoning Rome for an Eastern queen, the argument ran. He was giving Roman land to foreign children. He was under her spell. The spell framing was more useful to Octavian than the actual political charges, and he deployed it with the skill of someone who understood that wars are won in public opinion before they are won on battlefields. At the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, Cleopatra and Antony's combined fleet faced Octavian's, and lost, or rather withdrew, with Cleopatra's ships breaking from the engagement and Antony following her, and the fleet that remained surrendering. The retreat has been debated by historians for 2,000 years. Was it a planned tactical withdrawal, a moment of panic, a prearranged signal, or a straightforward failure of nerve? What it produced was irreversible. Antony's support collapsed. Octavian advanced on Egypt. Antony killed himself on the false report that Cleopatra was already dead. Cleopatra, captured and facing the prospect of being displayed in Octavian's triumph in Rome, paraded through the streets as a defeated foreign queen, which was the standard Roman victory theatre, died in her mausoleum, reportedly from a snake bite, though the method has never been confirmed. She was 39 years old. Caesarion was killed by Octavian's order shortly afterward. Egypt became a Roman province. The calculation that had kept it independent for 20 years had run out of moves. In 272 AD, the Roman Emperor Aurelian marched on the city of Palmyra with a full imperial army, because Queen Zenobia had, over the preceding 2 years, conquered Egypt, most of Asia Minor, and a significant portion of the Levant, and declared herself and her son co-emperors of an independent Palmyrene empire that had simply stopped being Roman. Zenobia, who claimed descent from Cleopatra, spoke Egyptian, Greek, Latin, and Aramaic, rode at the head of her own armies, and reportedly outdrank most of her male courtiers, while also writing scholarly treatises on the side, had decided that Rome's instability made this an excellent moment to stop pretending deference. She was not wrong about Rome's instability. She was slightly wrong about whether Rome would let it go. Aurelian didn't. Zenobia had come to power as regent for her young son Vaballathus, after the assassination of her husband Odaenathus in 267 or 68 AD. Odaenathus had been one of Rome's most valuable allies in the east, a Palmyrene king who had, on Rome's behalf, fought back the Sassanid Persian invasion that had captured the Emperor Valerian and threatened to dissolve the eastern half of the empire entirely. He had done this effectively and been rewarded with titles and authority that made Palmyra semi-autonomous within the Roman system. When he was assassinated, possibly by a nephew, possibly by others with motives the historical record does not clarify, Zenobia stepped into his role as if she had been preparing for it, which she may well have been. Her expansion began cautiously. In 270 she sent her general Zabdas into Egypt, which fell quickly. The Roman prefect Tenagina Probus was captured and executed, and Egypt's grain supply, the single most important resource in the eastern Mediterranean, came under Palmyrene control, then Asia Minor, then large portions of the Levant. By 271, Zenobia was issuing coinage with her own image and her son's, describing them with titles that were, in their implications, imperial. She was not claiming to replace Rome. She was claiming to be Rome, the legitimate Eastern expression of Roman civilization, at a time when Rome itself was in chaos, burning through emperors at a rate that made institutional continuity nearly impossible. It was not an unreasonable argument. The 3rd century AD was a period of such profound Roman instability, the crisis of the 3rd century in which the empire had approximately 50 emperors in 50 years, that several breakaway states had established themselves with some success. Zenobia's court was genuinely cultured. She patronized the philosopher Longinus, encouraged scholarship, corresponded with the leading intellectuals of her day, and governed Palmyra with an administrative competence that the sources, even hostile ones, acknowledge. She was not a warlord who had stumbled into territory. She was a ruler who had built something that looked, from inside it, like a viable alternative. Aurelian, who had spent his reign methodically reassembling the pieces of the Roman Empire, reached her in 272. He defeated her army at the battles of Emei and Emesa, advanced on Palmyra, and captured Zenobia herself as she attempted to flee toward the Sassanid Persian court on camelback. She was brought to Rome. The Palmyrene Empire collapsed immediately. Palmyra revolted once after her capture, killed the garrison Aurelian left, and was destroyed by Aurelian's returning army so thoroughly that it never recovered as a major city. What had taken Zenobia years to build took Aurelian months to dismantle. Zenobia's fate in Rome was, relative to what she might have expected, survivable. She was displayed in Aurelian's triumph, paraded through Rome in golden chains, the standard humiliation for defeated foreign rulers, but she was not executed. She was given a villa at Tibur and appears to have lived out her days in comfortable obscurity, possibly marrying a Roman senator, possibly becoming a philosopher and writer. The sources disagree, and the disagreement is somehow appropriate for a woman whose life defied the categories available to describe it. At some point in this story, it becomes necessary to ask a question that complicates everything. How much of what we call evil in these women is evil, and how much of it is survival in environments where the rules were designed by people who wanted them dead, powerless, or both? Would Zetian executed rivals in a court that executed rivals? Catherine de' Medici authorised violence in a religious war where both sides were authorising violence. Agrippina poisoned emperors in a dynasty where poisoning emperors was practically a tradition. This doesn't make what they did acceptable. It does make it harder to hold them to a different standard than the men around them who did similar things and got bronze statues. History has always been more comfortable with evil queens than with evil kings, which is worth noticing and worth sitting with. Consider the mathematics of the situation. Henry VIII of England had 2 wives executed, dissolved the monasteries with a thoroughness that displaced thousands of people, broke from Rome over a divorce dispute, and is remembered primarily as a colourful figure whose many marriages make for good television. Mary of England burned nearly 300 people at the stake in less than 4 years, and is Bloody Mary, a nickname so permanent it has been attached to a cocktail. The body counts are not identical, but the framing of them in popular memory is not remotely proportional to the numbers, and the direction of the disproportion is consistent. This pattern appears across cultures and centuries with a regularity that suggests it is not accidental. When a male ruler was ruthless, the ruthlessness was generally understood as an extension of the job requirements, unfortunate, perhaps excessive, but comprehensible within the logic of power. When a female ruler was ruthless, the ruthlessness required explanation, and the explanation almost always reached for something beyond politics: vanity, jealousy, sexual manipulation, madness, supernatural evil. Cleopatra was a seductress. Agrippina was unnaturally ambitious. Zetian was a usurper against the natural order. The actions were similar. The frameworks applied to them were not. This matters because the frameworks shape what gets recorded and what gets emphasized. The ancient sources on Agrippina were written by men who found female power disturbing, and said so explicitly. Tacitus describes her as driven by a masculine desire to rule, treating the adjective masculine as self-evidently damning, which tells you more about Tacitus than it tells you about Agrippina. The court historians who recorded Zetian's reign were operating within a Confucian framework in which female imperial rule was categorically illegitimate, which means their accounts of her crimes were written by people with ideological reasons to maximise them. Catherine de' Medici's reputation as a poisoner was constructed largely by Protestant propagandists during and after her lifetime, and propaganda is not evidence, however often it gets cited as such. None of this means the women in this video were innocent. Elizabeth Bathory tortured and killed hundreds of young women, and no amount of contextualizing changes the girls who died. Ranavalona I presided over population decimation through policies she chose and sustained. The Tangina ordeal killed real people in numbers that are genuinely horrifying. The context does not erase the crimes. What it does is ask you to notice when a woman is being held to a standard that the men around her were not, and to ask why, and to consider whether the answer to that question tells you something important about how history gets told and who gets to tell it. The discomfort of sitting with that question is, in the end, the most honest response to it. These women were powerful. Some of them were cruel. Some of them were cruel in ways that were shaped by the cruelty of the systems they operated in, and some of them were cruel in ways that went well beyond anything the system required. Holding all of that simultaneously, refusing to flatten them into either monsters or victims, is the only way to see them as they actually were. Human beings in impossible situations making choices, some of them terrible, some of them understandable, and some of them both at once. There is a pattern, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. A queen rules, is powerful, is feared, she dies, or is deposed. The historians, almost universally male, almost universally with access to her enemies' versions of events, write the record. The record includes poison, witchcraft, sexual manipulation, and unnatural ambition. The men who did equivalent things are described as ruthless or strategic. The women who did equivalent things are described as monstrous. Cleopatra's war strategy becomes seduction. Catherine de' Medici's political manoeuvring becomes witchcraft. Zetian's administrative reforms get a paragraph. Her supposed infanticide gets 3. This is not to say these women were innocent. Some of them were genuinely terrible, but the way history tells their stories reveals as much about the historians as it does about the queens, and the comfortable distance between she was evil and she was threatening is worth measuring very carefully. The literary afterlives of these women are, in their own way, a second chapter of their reigns, and in many cases more durable than the first. Cleopatra appears in Shakespeare as the embodiment of dangerous Eastern excess, all serpentine beauty and emotional manipulation, the antithesis of Roman virtue. The historical Cleopatra, the 9 languages, the military strategy, the 2 decades of successful independence, is present in the play, but subordinated to the seduction narrative, because the seduction narrative was what the audience and the sources and the playwright found most compelling. The play has outlasted most serious political histories of the 1st century BC in popular memory, which means Shakespeare's Cleopatra has, to a significant extent, become Cleopatra. Mary Queen of Scots became a martyr almost immediately after her execution, and the martyrdom narrative required a corresponding villain, which Queen Elizabeth I obligingly provided by virtue of having signed the death warrant. The 2 women, who were actually engaged in a cold political conflict over succession and religious legitimacy that had very little to do with personal animosity, became in the popular imagination a drama of feminine rivalry. The beautiful doomed Catholic queen against the calculating Protestant one that reduced a genuine political conflict to something that could be staged as a tragedy of 2 women who happened to share a bloodline and a conflict. Both of them were, in this version, defined primarily by their relationship to each other and to the men who circled them. Elizabeth Bathory became a vampire story. Not immediately, the vampire legend, as it crystallized in the 19th century, drew from multiple Eastern European sources, but her blood-bathing reputation fed directly into the archetype of the beautiful aristocratic woman who sustains herself through the destruction of young women, which is a metaphor that has proven remarkably durable. Bathory appears in films, novels, and games as a figure of Gothic horror. Her actual crimes, which were terrible enough without embellishment, buried under layers of supernatural elaboration that have made her famous in ways that the historical record alone probably would not have managed. What all of these afterlives share is a translation of political threat into personal pathology. The queen who was dangerous because she was powerful becomes the queen who was dangerous because she was vain or lustful or mad or cursed. The structural threat that a woman could rule, could accumulate power, could make decisions about war and religion and succession that shaped the lives of millions gets converted into something smaller, stranger, and more manageable. A monster is frightening. A politician is threatening. And for 5 centuries, history has often preferred its powerful women monstrous. Here is the last strange thing about history's most evil queens. They lasted. Not their reigns, which ended in exile, execution, imprisonment, or the slow fade of old age. Not their empires, which crumbled. But them, as ideas, as warnings, as inspirations, as the subjects of plays and operas and films, and this particular video playing quietly while you try to fall asleep. Wu Zetian's administrative reforms outlasted her dynasty. Cleopatra's name outlasted Rome. Elizabeth Bathory's name outlasted the Habsburg Empire that imprisoned her. Mary, Queen of Scots, became more powerful as a symbol than she ever was as a ruler. There is something about a woman who refused to stay small, even when staying small was the only safe option, that history cannot quite bring itself to bury, no matter how hard it has sometimes tried. The legacies are not tidy. They were never going to be tidy, because the women themselves were not tidy. They were contradictory, ambitious, occasionally monstrous, and stubbornly real in ways that resist the clean conclusions that make for comfortable historical narratives. Wu Zetian reformed a civil examination system that shaped Chinese governance for centuries after her death, opening paths to power for men of talent rather than merely men of birth. a genuinely progressive achievement embedded in a reign that also involves secret police, manufactured accusations, and the probable murder of anyone who made governance inconvenient. Both of those things are her legacy. You do not get to choose one and ignore the other. Cleopatra left behind a son who was killed, a dynasty that ended, and an Egypt that became a province. She also left behind the most enduring example in the ancient world of a female ruler who was taken seriously as a political and military force by the most powerful men of her era, not because they liked her, but because they couldn't afford not to. Caesar allied with her. Antony built a program with her. Octavian was sufficiently threatened by her that he killed her son to neutralize a claim. Being feared by the most powerful men in the world is not nothing. Being remembered for 2,000 years is not nothing. The province that replaced her kingdom is gone. She isn't. Mary, Queen of Scots, achieved in death what she never quite managed in life: moral authority. Her execution galvanized Catholic Europe, contributed to the growing instability that would eventually produce the Spanish Armada, and generated a cult of martyrdom that her son James, who became James VI of Scotland and James I of England, was careful to maintain for his own political purposes, while doing absolutely nothing to avenge it. She was more useful as a dead queen than she had been as a living one, which is a form of immortality that is both genuine and deeply melancholy. These women mattered. Not because they were good, several of them were not good, and pretending otherwise would be a disservice to the people they harmed. They mattered because they existed in a world that did not expect them to matter, and then refused to be insignificant anyway. They reached for power in systems designed to keep it from them, held it in ways those systems did not anticipate, and lost it in ways that reverberated long past their own lifetimes. The queens who burned, who poisoned, who bricked their enemies into walls and blinded their children and ordered executions before breakfast, they were terrible, some of them. They were also, in the most fundamental sense, present. They showed up. They made history move, and history, which has spent centuries trying to explain them away as monsters or madwomen, has never quite managed to make them disappear. Somewhere in the story of every woman in this video is a moment, a single afternoon, a decision at a corridor junction, a letter written or burned or sent, where the thing that made her dangerous and the thing that made her human were the same thing, and you cannot separate them without losing both. That is why we are still talking about them. And that, if you are still awake and still listening, is probably why you started. You have spent the last several hours in the company of women who poisoned their rivals and blinded their children, who burned the innocent and bricked up the guilty, who swam to shore after their own sons tried to drown them, and then sent a polite note home about it. You've been in the courts of Tang Dynasty China, and Tudor England, and Byzantine Constantinople, and the Forbidden City, and a castle in Hungary that everyone nearby knew something was wrong with, and nobody said so for years. You have met women who were terrifying, and women who were terrifying because the world left them no other available option, and women who are both of those things simultaneously, which is the most honest category of the three. And here is what sits with you, if you let it. Every single woman in this story was told, at some point, in some form, by some combination of law and custom and religion, and the men immediately around her, to be smaller, to want less, to perform gratitude for whatever scraps of power she had been allocated, and ask politely for nothing further, to smile at the banquet where someone was probably poisoning her wine, and compliment the host on the vintage. Some of them listened. The ones who listened are not in this video because history did not find them interesting enough to record. The ones who didn't listen, who pushed back, who grabbed, who manoeuvred and schemed and occasionally committed acts that no amount of context makes comfortable, those are the ones we are still talking about 1,000 years later. That is not an endorsement of what they did. The girls who died at Sait Castle did not deserve to die there. The people who burned under Mary's reign did not deserve to burn. The Malagasy villagers who swallowed the Tangina and did not survive it were not morally abstract. They were real people with families and futures, and the misfortune of living under a queen who treated their lives as administrative tools. The suffering in this story was real. It should not be waved away by the interesting complexity of the women who caused it. But the women were also real. They were not fairy tale villains conjured from the collective imagination to explain why female power made people nervous. They were human beings born into impossible systems, shaped by grief and humiliation and ambition and faith and fear, and the specific alchemy that happens when a person is told for long enough that they do not matter, and then discovers that they do, that they can, that the machinery of power can be touched and moved and redirected if you are willing to pay the price for touching it. Some of them paid prices that history judged worth it. Some of them paid prices that history judged unforgivable. Some of them are still being argued about, which may be the closest thing to immortality that this particular world offers. So tonight, as you settle into the warmth of your unremarkable and quietly miraculous life, your bed that nobody shares without your permission, your name that nobody can strip away, your tomorrow that you're reasonably confident will arrive, maybe let yourself sit for a moment with the sheer strangeness of history, with the fact that the world you are lying in was shaped, in ways both visible and invisible, by women who were told they were nothing and responded by becoming unforgettable, by queens who were monstrous and queens who were magnificent, and queens who were both in the same afternoon and never once apologised for taking up space. They are done now. Their courts are dust. Their enemies are dust. Their names, against all reasonable expectation, are not. And somewhere in the long quiet of history that is its own kind of victory. Sleep well.